Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Richmond Hill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to participate in today's debate. I want to point out, first of all, that the Liberal Party supports the replacement of the C-18s, and obviously the replacement is absolutely critical. This party has stood and continues to stand to support our military, and it was in 2005 that the Paul Martin government brought in the largest amount of money in support of the Defence Department. That was $15 billion. This issue really is about process. It's about how this has developed into what the government is now claiming to be an agreement in which we are to purchase 65 F-35s. Obviously, to protect our north, guard our sovereignty, all of these we all agree with. The process, however, is, I think, at the core of this debate. A process that didn't involve any government effort to negotiate a better price for Canadian taxpayers. You know, currently we have a $56 billion deficit in this country, and the government is going to borrow up to $16 billion plus for this new fighter aircraft. Who's going to pay for these? Well, obviously the taxpayers, and clearly at a time when we don't have those dollars. A process that didn't follow the very rules that this government has sworn to uphold, and which this government used to quote when, of course, responding to us when we were the government. This process not only pretty much guarantees we're going to be overpaying for the CF-18 replacements for the next 30 years, but also undercut industry's right, Mr. Speaker, to deal with the right to guarantee benefits, particularly on the economic side for Canadian industry. This, of course, is not the process the government is supposed to follow when making these types of major procurements. And let me quote, Mr. Speaker, from the Treasury Board guidelines, which lay out the proper process our government should have followed when making this procurement, which our national experts have spent decades developing to ensure that we get the best deal on purchases like this. In Section 9.45 Treasury Board guidelines, it clearly states competition remains the cornerstone of Canadian government procurement process. It's the most effective and the most efficient way of achieving the goals of government. It gives suppliers the incentive to bring forward their best solution to the operational problem at a competitive price, as well as respond to more effective requirements in support of other national objectives. Well, what happened in this case? Well, in this case, clearly the government took an end run on these guidelines. And yet, for 4 years now, the government has increasingly ignored the competitive process. So it's not just in this case of the F-35s. Don't take my word for it. I would like to point out to you, Mr. Speaker, that statistics before the Defence Committee that we heard last month from the man who used to be in charge of the Department's procurement section said the following. Statistics show that under the previous Liberal government of Paul Martin in 2004, only 8.8% of defence spending was spent through untendered contracts. In 2005, this number still remained relatively low at 14.6. But in 2006, we started to see the beginning of a drastic increase under the Conservatives. That year, 27.3% of defence spending bypassed the competitive process, a number that increased again to 31.9% the following year. And compare that today, at 42% of defence contracts Conservatives have signed last year without any competitive process. 42% uncompetitive. So no wonder we have racked up the largest deficit in Canadian history. Because again, we're not going out and getting the best price, we're simply sole sourcing. And this obviously is costing you and I, Mr. Speaker, members of the Canadian public, the taxpayer, a significant amount of dollars. That's what competition is there for. It's to get the best price, to make sure the Canadian taxpayer is getting value for dollar. And this party has talked about value for dollar with regard to this issue from the beginning. And that is a responsibility that the government has chosen to ignore. The other reason, of course, is to make sure that we get the best equipment available to us. And never is this more important than we're talking about military procurements for our men and women in the Air Force. We want to make sure that they have the best tools available. And again, without an active, open, transparent, fair competition, we don't know that. And we certainly at the Defence Committee, I can point out to you, we've heard from Boeing, we've heard from other competitors who've come forward and have clearly indicated this was not a competitive process. who've indicated they can provide value for dollar, in fact, less cost to the taxpayer. And yet the government has chosen to ignore that and is, again, a sole source contract. So that obviously is of concern to this party. It's a concern to me as the Vice Chair of the Defence Committee. And I'd point out to you that the government keeps talking about next generation fighter aircraft. Well, next generation is actually it's a catchphrase. It's a, if you will, Mr. Speaker, a marketing slogan that has been used in order to talk about the issue of this particular aircraft. And I think it is incumbent upon all parliamentarians to make sure that we do get value for dollar. It's incumbent upon all parliamentarians to ensure that the process as outlined in the Treasury Board guidelines is followed. And if that is not followed, then we cannot be sure, and we clearly are not sure, that we're getting the best price for Canadian taxpayers. And the debate and the discussion that I've heard from the government, of course, is that, you know, the JSF was developed, there was a so-called competition between Boeing and Lockheed Martin in the United States. And I would point out to you that now, in the United States, the American government is quite concerned about the cost overruns of this jet, as are the British, as are other countries in terms of this. Obviously, one of the things that we have not been able to glean from the government is, why is this the best aircraft in terms of the needs and the capabilities that we need as a country for the Arctic, as an example? Is this the aircraft that we absolutely need? And of course, we will continue to debate this, and it is unfortunate when this was announced by the minister. It was announced in July, in the summer. Now, this government has a tremendous record of announcing things outside of the purview of Parliament. We heard that last week with regard to the issue of training for our soldiers in Afghanistan. We've seen budgets that have been presented outside of this institution. And that erodes the role of and the authority of members of Parliament. And I think that is something which is why now the Defence Committee has taken up this particular debate, and why this party has put forward this important motion today to discuss this issue. The fact is that cost overruns have to be and continue to be a major concern, and we don't even know what the operational life costs are going to be in terms of this aircraft. And you know, my friends across the way will say, well, on the C-18s, you know, we didn't have that till 4 years after the fact. Well, you know, the costs that we're looking at for this aircraft alone are the most we've ever paid, and obviously those additional costs could go well beyond 18. It could go 25, 30, some estimates. And obviously, when the British and others are starting to look at this and saying, well, you know, maybe we better scale back, or maybe we really should look at this whole component again, whether or not we can even afford that, that is an issue. And I point out, Mr. Speaker, Winslow Wheeler, who is a renowned defense analyst, been around the United States Congress for over 30 years, had pointed out a number of issues, deficiencies with regard to this aircraft. And we are obviously going to be looking at that, and some members of the Defense Committee will have an opportunity to go down to Texas, and we'll have an opportunity to talk to the manufacturer and ask some of those tough questions. And again, I want people to understand that we certainly are asking the questions, and we certainly are going to continue to ask the questions, which is why I think it's important that we go to Texas and that we talk to the manufacturer, and that we be able to ask not only them, but hopefully Boeing and others in terms of what they can provide. Because again, this contract will not officially be signed for about 3 years, and it is important that we do that. And so, you know, my friends across the way have agreed, and we're going to go and do that. And I think, again, we're looking for value for dollar. We want to make sure we get the right aircraft. But again, some of the issues on operational capability, on issues dealing with, is this the right aircraft, particularly for the North, as a single engine versus a dual engine plane. Those are issues, Mr. Speaker, that we are going to be continuing to ask. But again, make no mistake, we support the replacement, the CF-18s. The issue is whether or not, A, we can afford what is being proposed by the government, and secondly, whether or not it is the plane for the forces. So again, thank you, Mr. Speaker, for your attention.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of National Defence.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I do work with my honourable colleague on the Defence Committee, and by and large we have a pretty good working relationship. We get things done, but I do have to challenge him on a couple of things. First of all, the amount of money we're talking about really starts in 2015, 2016, doesn't start today, and it's spread over a period of 20 years. So let's be clear about that. The $3.2 billion they keep talking about that we would save if we had a competition, that is a completely fantasy number pulled out of the air by someone who used to be the ADM Materiel 5 years ago, rather than listening to the person who's been the ADM Materiel for the past 5 years, who is currently working with the MOU, with all the allies, and frankly has much more credibility. The other aspect, and he talked about sole sourcing, you know, in 2004, we were not at war like we are today. Arguably, we were at war. We were at war with Volkswagen Jeeps, which is the kind of equipment that the Paul Martin government and the Chrétien government before him had equipped us with. When a country is at war, there is a certain urgency to equipment requirements for safety on the battlefield, and that's what we have been providing, and that's one of the reasons for sole sourcing. So I'd like to challenge him on that $3.2 billion. Where is the justification for that, other than somebody's opinion?
The Honourable Member for Richmond Hill.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I never mentioned the $3.2 billion. So that didn't come out of my speech, Mr. Speaker, and I'm really not going to respond to that specifically. I am going to respond to the fact that the government, and my central thesis in my speech, was about the fact that Treasury Board rules have not been followed, and that in fact today we are spending 42% in terms of those contracts are all sole sourced. So my question is, how do we know we're getting value for dollar when 42% of all the contracts are in fact sole sourced? And in terms of equipping the armed forces, and my friends across the way, and I work very well with my colleague, as he indicated across the way, is the fact that when we went into Afghanistan in 2001, no one, not even the military, could predict what it is we were going to run up against. But in 2005, we did provide the largest expenditure towards the Defense Department in the history of this country. We brought in Coyotes, we brought in the kind of equipment that the forces have today, and the forces have that because of what the Martin government brought in at the time. So, my friend, you know, a little revisionist historiography over there I know works well in some quarters. It doesn't work well here. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Speaker. Well, I've listened to this debate with great interest, and I noted the question to the Honourable Member about when a country is at war. I have found this debate thus far on this topic and the whole discussion incredibly myopic. Last I noticed, and nobody's pointed out to me, since I've been elected, I have not been able to vote to go to war. And my understanding, this government has announced, without any vote, that we are supposedly now not going to be engaged in a war in Afghanistan. In fact, it's going to be over sometime next year, probably, if we stick to the current policy. So if we're not going to be at war anymore, I guess the obvious question is, in this time of profound economic decline and major recession in this country, the obvious question would be is, based on a poll that just came out where 71% of Canadians said the money could be better spent on acting on climate change, not on waging war. My question to the member would be, is surely this money could be better spent to support our armed forces because we're moving into the Arctic. Why not invest majorly in search and rescue and surveillance?
The Honourable Member for Richmond Hill.
Well, in fact, Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable colleague for the question. And in fact, search and rescue is another issue that, in fact, the Defence Committee is seized with. And in fact, yes, we do need search and rescue aircraft. There's no question about that. But we also need aircraft to patrol the north, obviously, in terms of protection of our sovereignty. I think no one would argue that. The issue really is this, what type of aircraft do we need in terms of the capabilities for warfare 10, 15, 20 years down the road? And is it the kind of aircraft we needed 20 years ago? Well, clearly not. In terms of support for troops on the ground, the type of aircraft that is going to be used is going to be different than it was 20 years ago. But the fact is, could it be better spent? Well, again, it's going back to 9.5 of the Treasury Board guidelines. The way we would find that is if we had an open and fair and transparent competition. But no question that her point on search and rescue aircraft is one thing that definitely we've been pushing on this government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.